ever feel like you're just drowning in sadness after you've lost someone?
Yeah.
Like you can't tell if it's just grief or if it's maybe like actually depression.
Yeah, it's a really common concern, actually. A lot of people find themselves kind of stuck in that gray area.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly what we're diving into today with some help from this blog post we found called, Is It Grief or Depression?
Oh, that's a good one. I think I remember reading that one, yeah.
It's like having a roadmap, right, to help us figure out if those more difficult feelings after a loss are, a normal part of healing or a sign that maybe things are heading in a different direction.
It is. And like a good roadmap, this blog starts by, acknowledging those things that grief and depression often share. They actually have a lot of overlap when it comes to symptoms, which can make it so confusing.
Yeah, totally. It's like both grief and depression can show up as, I don't know, that really intense sadness, or you're not sleeping well. Maybe even eating feels impossible.
Right? It's like you're just not interested in the things you used to love and you
hmm
can't focus on anything. Your brain just feels stuck.
Ugh, yeah, like it's on repeat, constantly replaying every detail of the loss,
Mm.
and it makes it like almost impossible to think about anything else. So, if both grief and depression share these signs, how do we know when it's time to maybe, start to worry? What's that first flashing neon sign that maybe this is more than just a rough patch?
Well, one of the most telling factors is time. Grief, you can think of it kind of like ocean waves. They come in strong, they can knock you down, but they also recede. You get these moments to catch your breath.
Okay, I like that imagery.
But depression, on the other hand, it's more like getting caught in a rip current. It's that feeling of being pulled under constantly, and you don't get those moments of relief.
So it's not just, feeling down, it's how long you've been feeling that way, like how long you've been pulled under. This blog post actually like puts a number on it, right?
It does. 2 weeks, that's kind of the mental health rule of thumb. If these intense feelings, this, heavy sadness, if they stick around for 2 weeks or more, it's definitely a sign to reach out for professional help. But even before that 2 week mark, there's another big difference: how you see the future, like your overall outlook.
Okay, so with grief, even when it's really intense, there's still that tiny little spark, right? That belief that someday, maybe not today, but someday, things will feel even a little bit lighter.
Right.
Is that what starts to disappear with depression?
You hit the nail on the head. That's like one of the cruelest things about depression. It really can steal that spark of hope. Grief might make you question the future, like, what does my future even look like now? But depression, it can sometimes make it feel like there is no future, or at least not one that feels, I don't know, worth sticking around for.
Man, that is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And it makes that whole feeling of hopelessness a really, really big red flag to watch out for. This blog post also talks about guilt, which honestly is something I know I've struggled with after a loss.
Yeah.
But it sounds like grief and depression kind of do guilt in different ways. You know what I mean?
They do. With grief, guilt tends to be more specific, like a spotlight shining on those moments related to the loss, like maybe if I'd called more or if I told them I loved them just one more time. But with depression, that guilt, it becomes less about specific actions and more like floodlight. It's like this overwhelming feeling of being unworthy, like your whole being is flawed.
So instead of blaming yourself for specific actions, you just start to feel fundamentally flawed as a person, like who you are as a person is bad or wrong.
Exactly. It's a really painful shift, and honestly, it's often one that needs professional support to work through. And speaking of needing help, this blog post, it doesn't shy away from the really serious side of depression, especially when it comes to, suicidal thoughts.
And that's something we can't gloss over. I think when some people hear the phrase suicidal thoughts, they might not understand like the difference between what might be a normal part of grief versus a really serious warning sign. So can we break that down a little bit?
For sure. I mean, look, it's completely understandable, especially in those early stages of grief, to have those fleeting thoughts of wanting to be with the person you've lost. Your heart is just yearning for them, for that connection again. It's like a deep longing.
Yeah, totally.
But it's so important to pay attention to how often these thoughts come up and, how intense they feel.
So if those thoughts like become less like fleeting wishes and more like urges, more frequent urges, that's a sign to get help right away.
Yes. And especially if you or someone you love is starting to actually make plans, putting their affairs in order, that's when you need to reach out immediately. Like, don't wait. Talk to someone, whether it's a crisis hotline, a therapist, a trusted friend, family member. There is help out there. You absolutely don't have to go through this alone.
That is such a crucial reminder. But even if, thankfully, those really serious thoughts aren't present, There are other things, other red flags this blog talks about that might surprise people. It's like depression can kind of be a chameleon, showing up in these sneaky ways that you might not even realize are connected.
Oh, absolutely.
So should we maybe pull back the curtain on those a bit?
Yeah, let's shed some light on those often overlooked signs because honestly, the more we know, the better we're able to support ourselves and the people we care about.
I love it. Knowledge is power. Okay, so everyone listening, get ready because things are about to get really insightful. We're going deep on those subtle cues that it might be time to reach out for help. Stay tuned. So we've covered some of the big differences between, like, grief and depression. But I'm really glad this blog post digs even deeper into the details, the stuff that's easy to miss if you're not really paying attention.
Yeah, it's like those hidden bonus tracks on an album, you know? The ones that totally surprise you and become your new favorites.
Yes. Okay, so tell me about some of those bonus tracks when it comes to, like, the sneakier signs of depression. What stood out to you?
Well, one that I think is super interesting is how depression can actually change the way someone talks.
Really? Wait, like they suddenly develop a British accent out of nowhere?
Haha, no, not quite that dramatic. It's more about these subtle shifts, like maybe they start speaking slower than usual, or they pause a lot, or they seem to have trouble finding the right words, like they're just out of reach.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can easily fly under the radar if you're not really looking for it.
Totally. And it's interesting because now that you mention, I can relate to that feeling of like, when I'm down, my thoughts feel like they're moving in slow motion. It's hard to explain, but I never would have thought of that as a possible sign of depression.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how much we might miss if we're not paying attention to the whole picture, you know? And another part of that picture that often gets overlooked is the physical stuff.
Oh, you mean like when you're like having aches and pains or your stomach's always acting up or you're just constantly exhausted?
Exactly. All those things can actually be linked to depression, too. It's not just an emotional thing. It affects our bodies, too.
It's wild, right? Because I feel like I'm always blaming that stuff on like, oh, I'm just getting old or I'm so stressed.
Right. It's easy to chalk it up to something else, but it's
Yeah.
so important to, like, tune into those physical sensations and recognize that they might be trying to tell us something, too.
That is such a good point. Like our bodies are literally trying to send us a signal, but we're too busy hitting this snooze button, like you said.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say someone's listening and they're like, okay, yeah, this is me. I'm hearing my theme music right now. That can feel really overwhelming, right? To realize you might need help, but not even know where to begin.
Absolutely. It's like standing at the bottom of a mountain, knowing you have to climb it, but having no idea which path to take.
But this blog post, thankfully, it doesn't just like leave us hanging there. It actually gives some really great advice on where to find support, which is so, so crucial.
I love that. It's like, instead of just saying, hey, you're lost, it's like, hey, here's a map, and here's a compass, and here's a first aid kit just in case.
Exactly.
And one thing I really appreciate is that it emphasizes that reaching out for help, it's not a weakness. It actually takes a lot of strength.
It really does. It takes courage to say, hey, I'm struggling. I need some backup. It's like asking for directions when you're lost, you know?
Sure.
Doesn't mean you're a failure. It means you're smart enough to realize you don't have to figure everything out on your own.
Right. Like, why make things harder on yourself? And just like there are different roads that can lead you to the same destination, there are different paths you can take to find the right kind of support. So where do we even start? This blog post mentions a few options like support groups, therapy. They even touch on medication. Where should we dive in first?
I think a great starting point, especially if you're feeling really raw and vulnerable after a loss, is support groups. And specifically, there are groups that are designed for people who are grieving, who've experienced a loss.
Yeah, because those groups, they offer something that you just can't get from talking to your friends or family, even if they have the best intentions, right? It's that shared experience, that feeling of like, oh my gosh, you get it. You truly get it without me having to explain every little thing.
Yes. And it's not even just about sharing your pain. It's also about learning from other people who are further along on that path, you know?
Yeah.
They've picked up coping mechanisms, resources, and sometimes, honestly, just seeing someone else surviving, even thriving after a loss can be so incredibly powerful.
It's like finding your people, you know, the ones who just get it on a deeper level, which could be so comforting during those early days of grief. But then, even within a supportive group, sometimes you need something more personalized, something tailored specifically to you.
Right.
And that's where I think therapy can be a game changer. This blog post talks about how valuable it can be, especially when you're trying to like untangle those messy feelings of grief and figure out if depression's also part of the equation.
Totally. It's like having an emotional detective on your side. helping you make sense of all those clues and figure out what's really going on.
I like that. Just like there are different types of detectives, there are different types of therapy that might be a good fit for different people. This blog post specifically mentions CBT and IPT as being really effective for treating depression.
Yeah.
So can you give us a little crash course on what those even are?
Yeah, for sure. So CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's kind of based on this idea that our brains are like computers, and sometimes we develop these faulty programs, these negative thought patterns that keep us feeling depressed. So CBT is like learning how to rewrite those programs.
So instead of just thinking, I'll never be happy again, CBT gives you the tools to challenge that thought, to find evidence against it.
Exactly. It's about learning how to identify and challenge those negative thoughts and replace them with more balanced, more helpful ones, which can then have a ripple effect on your behaviors and your emotions.
So it's like retraining your brain to see things differently.
Exactly.
Okay, cool, cool. And what about IPT? What's the deal with that one?
So IPT stands for interpersonal therapy. And as you might guess from the name, it focuses on relationships, like how our relationships with others can impact our mental health.
Okay.
Depression, it often affects our connections with the people around us. It can lead to conflicts, or it might make us withdraw and isolate ourselves. So what IPT does is it helps you repair and strengthen those connections.
Oh, so if you're noticing that your relationships are feeling strained or you feel like you're pushing people away, IPT could be really helpful for rebuilding those bridges.
Exactly. It's about understanding how those relationship patterns are playing a role in your depression and learning how to create healthier, more fulfilling connections.
That makes sense. It's like they always say, we're stronger together.
Yeah.
So we've talked about therapy, we've talked about support groups. Now, this blog post does mention medication, too. Is that something you want to touch on briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the blog post does mention that antidepressants can be a helpful tool for some people, and for some people, they're essential. But it's really important to remember that that's a conversation to have with your doctor or a psychiatrist. They can help you weigh the pros and cons, consider any potential side effects, and just make sure it's the right choice for you.
It's about finding what works for you,
Yeah.
right? Because everyone's different, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And it's not about, just masking the symptoms. It's about finding ways to support yourself while you're doing that deeper work of healing.
I love it. Okay, so we've talked about the signs of depression, the different paths to getting support.
Hmm.
But now I'm really curious to dive into what healing actually looks like.
Yeah.
Because it's rarely a straight line from heartbreak to happiness, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
So we've explored all the twists and turns of grief and depression, all those moments when healing can feel impossible.
Yeah.
But one thing I really appreciate about this blog post is that it doesn't just leave us in that dark place. It brings us back to something really important. Grief in itself is actually a natural, even a healthy part of being human.
Yes, absolutely. It's easy to get, caught up in all the clinical terms, the warning signs. We can forget that grief really comes from love.
Mm.
It's proof that we had these deep, meaningful connections, even if the person's not physically with us anymore.
It's like that quote, what is it? Grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot.
Oh, that's good, yeah.
It's messy, it's powerful. And yeah, sometimes it just totally knocks us flat. But it doesn't mean that, we're broken.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to just let ourselves grieve, to let ourselves feel those waves of sadness, anger, even those unexpected moments of laughter or relief. It's okay. There's no judgment.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we try to rush the process or we try to pretend it's not happening. But that usually backfires, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like trying to squeeze a giant fluffy pillow back into its tiny little case. You're just asking for trouble. Grief needs space. It needs to, breathe.
I love that. It makes me think of that saying, you can't rush healing any more than you can rush growing a tree. And just like everyone's, journey through life is different, everyone grieves in their own way, at their own pace.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong way to do it, right?
Exactly. As long as you're not, like you said, harming yourself or others, it's really about honoring whatever feels right for you in each moment.
And that's where those support systems we talked about, having a therapist, having a support group, even just having one or two people you can really be real with, that can make all the difference.
Oh, 100%. Because when you're grieving, you need people who can help you weather those emotional storms. Mm-hmm. But they're also there to celebrate with you when the sun finally peeks through the clouds.
Yes, because that's the thing about grief. It's not always like doom and gloom
Yeah.
24/7. As you move through the process, there will be times when the waves feel smaller, less intense. Maybe you find yourself laughing more easily or just enjoying things again. And sometimes that can actually bring up a whole new layer of guilt.
Oh, for sure. It's like, wait, am I allowed to feel happy now? Am I betraying the memory of the person I lost?
Yes. It's like, is it okay if I'm not completely heartbroken every second of every day?
Yeah, and it's so common to feel that way. But here's the thing. Feeling joy again, it doesn't mean you loved them any less or that you don't miss them just as much. It just means you're finding ways to carry that grief in a way that allows you to, I don't know, to live again.
Yeah. It's like you're learning to integrate that loss into your life. It becomes a part of your story, but it doesn't have to define your entire story.
I love that.
Someone once told me that grief is like carrying around a smooth, worn scone in your pocket. Like at first, it's heavy and sharp, a constant reminder of what you've lost. But over time, the edges soften, and while you still feel the weight of it, it doesn't like cut you the same way anymore.
That's such a beautiful image. It really speaks to the fact that grief, as painful as it is, can also be incredibly transformative.
Right, because it forces you to look at life differently.
Yeah, you're forced to confront these really big questions to figure out what really matters to you. And sometimes, that process, that cracking open, it can lead to incredible growth. You become more empathetic, maybe you appreciate the little things more. You just have this newfound understanding of how precious life really is.
I love that. And it makes me think about, those beautiful kintsugi bowls. How they're broken into pieces, but then they're put back together with
Oh,
gold.
yeah, they're gorgeous.
It's like, we're those bowls.
Yeah.
We're broken apart by loss. But if we allow ourselves to heal, we can come back together even stronger, more beautiful for having been broken.
What a beautiful way to put it. And it makes me think of that thought-provoking question that this blog post leaves us with. How might seeking help for ourselves or loved ones be an act of honoring the memory of those we've lost?
Wow, that is powerful. Because for so long, I think a lot of us have been taught, to just be strong, to power through it. But maybe taking care of ourselves,
Right.
allowing ourselves to heal and grow, maybe that's the real tribute.
Maybe that's how we truly honor their legacy, by living our lives fully and authentically, even with that empty space that they once filled.
Man, that is such a powerful message, and it's a perfect note to end on. So if you're out there listening and you're struggling after a loss, please know you're not alone. And there's no shame in reaching out for support, whether it's a therapist, a support group, a trusted friend, family member, whoever it is. It's okay to ask for help.
Yes, and never underestimate the power of sharing your story. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and connect with others who understand, amazing things can happen.
This has been such a moving and insightful conversation. Thank you all for joining us today on this deep dive into the complexities of grief and depression. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic, but until then, take care of yourselves and remember, there's always hope, even in the darkest of times.